Jesus was the greatest preacher who ever lived, and the Sermon on the Mount is arguably his greatest sermon. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you for my name's sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We call those the Beatitudes. And then comes the similitudes. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And then we have 6 contrasts. I haven't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And by the way, if you want to get into the kingdom of heaven, you have to do better than those making that false accusation against me. And your submission to the king and his kingdom must do better than that of the scribes and the Pharisees, who are leveling these kinds of false accusations. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you, this is how it is. 6 times. You have a clear demarcation of main themes that come up through this sermon. And then you open up to Matthew chapter 6, and we have a new unit, a new main point, if you will. Worship without showmanship. And the thesis of this new section is found in verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Your righteousness, the same word is used in chapter 5, verse 6, chapter 5, verse 20. Hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Your righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. But don't practice your righteousness to be seen. The emphasis here is on righteous conduct, as opposed to the righteousness conferred through one stroke of divine mercy. Righteousness is used those 2 ways in the New Testament. A righteousness by virtue of forgiveness through Jesus' blood, and a righteous conduct that proceeds from that. as Jesus not only forgives us, but he transforms us. Godly piety, if you will. The New English Bible speaks of this as making a show of religion, an ostentatious, hypocritical sham, a religious show. Paul Earnhardt says there is perhaps no greater rival for the love we owe to God than the human ego. But what about what Jesus has already said in chapter 5, verse 16? Does chapter 6, verse 1 contradict that? Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. Chapter 5, verse 16, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Like the Statue of Liberty, we are holding up the torch of God's light. Do we have a contradiction here? A.B. Bruce, the commentator from the 1800s, said we should show when tempted to hide, and we should hide when tempted to show. I do not believe Jesus is saying in chapter 6, verse 1, that you are to privatize your faith. That's reinforced by secularists all around us all the time. You can bring into the public forum anything and everything but your faith. You keep that to yourself. Is that what Jesus is saying here? We might be tempted to believe it because, again, that's reinforced all the time by our neighbors all around us. What Jesus is saying is not to parade your faith as a hypocritical sham with all the fanfare and performance of that. As Solomon has taught us in the adult Bible class in the auditorium, this ultimately comes down to motive. The ultimate objective here, the ultimate motivation behind doing what you do is the glory of God. And if you're tempted to hide your faith, then you're hiding the glory of God. And if you're tempted to parade your faith hypocritically, you're hiding the glory of God. And our objective in living out our faith through this minefield of life on earth is to highlight the glory of God. So practicing your righteousness just to be seen by others is dangerous business. And Jesus gives three applications of that in the verses that follow. Almsgiving, verses 2 through 4, prayer, verses 5 through 15, fasting, verses 16 through 18. And this morning we're going to look at almsgiving and fasting. We're going to look at the two buns, then we'll look at the meat of the hamburger next week in prayer. But the applications are going to be largely the same, whether we're talking about giving, prayer, or fasting. And as an aside, let me say also that I do believe Jesus did have a sense of humor. Elton Trueblood wrote a book years ago called The Humor of Christ. And one of my mentors, Robert Turner, wrote an article with that book in mind. Did Christ laugh? And I believe that some of us think that when we walk into a church building, we have to put such a long face on that we can never lighten up a little bit. But the truth of the matter is, Jesus said some things that are downright funny, particularly when he caricatures people who took themselves way too seriously in their hypocrisy. You read statements like found in Matthew 23 of the Pharisees that they would strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. That's funny. It's intended to be funny. And here the caricature that he gives of sounding a trumpet, dun 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 dun. Look at me while I give alms here. That's intended to be to poke fun at people who need to smile at the ridiculousness we bring into our lives sometimes. So Jesus did have a sense of humor. And he speaks here of hypocrisy, which in the ancient Greek world was used of play actors who would put on a false face, a mask. And by way of extension, it's used here of those of us who would wear a mask in our piety, of presenting one side of ourselves to the religious world, if you will, while there's a very other side of our lives that we might be ashamed to parade before the world. And Jesus is urging us to be consistent about that. What you see is what you get, or at least it should be. So he speaks of donations or almsgiving. He speaks of prayer. He speaks of fasting. And again, we'll look at the first and the third of those this morning. The idea of giving alms, Jesus does not establish any specific institutions of worship here. He simply takes kingdom principles, he illustrates them with the expressions of piety already familiar to his audience in first century Judaism. Almsgiving, like prayer and fasting, was nothing new to them. And it was to be done out of generosity, not out of selfishness or stinginess. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 3, if I give my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. The motivation behind why you do what you do is critically important. There is a case in the early church that fits this, of a couple who sold a piece of property, gave part of the proceeds of that investment return, laid it at the apostles' feet, and lied about it. And the entire motivation was to look good. They wanted to look good and emulate other outstanding Christians like Barnabas, so much that they lied about the gift. And the Apostle Peter says, you've not lied to men, but to God. And they dropped dead on the spot, Acts chapter 5. Giving is turned sour by perverse motives. But there will be a lot of abuse when it comes to giving. There always has been. There would be a ravenous hunger for the praise of men. And Satan would follow people right up to the temple coffers and turn their contributions into sin. Jesus gives an amusing caricature of a public performance here of trumpeters and fanfare. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Again, we have this amusing caricature and the hypocrisy that attends to it. A hypocrite would lay aside his true identity, put on a disguise, impersonate someone else, enter a world of pretending, a world of make-believe. When I preach on this, sometimes I give the illustration of playing church. And I grew up in a preacher's family, and some of you old timers here have heard this illustration before, but just put up with me for the next minute. I'd get together with my cousins, and they were also preachers' kids, and we were preachers' kids, and we entertained ourselves simple ways way back in the day. And we'd get off in a corner of a room in the house, and there would be one of my cousins would be the song leader, and one would be the preacher, and one would lead the prayer, and we'd have a whole church service. I can remember that one time it befell my lot to be the preacher, and I could barely read, but I looked up in a concordance. I wanted to preach hellfire and brimstone, and so the key word was hail, Hail. Yeah, I couldn't spell, but I was a future preacher anyway. Um, and so I turned to the passage in Exodus, one of the 10 plagues, and figured out really quickly this was not hell at the end of time. And I thought quickly on my feet and said something like, and if you think that's bad, just wait till the end of time. And sometimes we'd get really zealous and bring out the crackers and the grape juice. And if we got really zealous, we'd fill up the bathtub. And you know what's coming next. And those were fun times. But the sad thing is when adults come together and they just play at this. Kids are doing it innocently, imitating their adults. But when adults come together and play church, they're not serious about this, they're not earnest, genuine, unhypocritical about what we're doing. Jesus is poking fun at the Pharisees to make a point to all of us. But have you ever been tempted to publicize a good deed? To focus the spotlight on yourself as that deed is being performed? Or maybe you did a good deed inconspicuously, then advertised it later when the right people were there, just to make a good impression. Sometimes it's better just to let God know about it and not other people. Jesus says they have their reward in full. And he's using a terminology which in Greek was commercial, technical terminology, to receive a sum in full and give a receipt for it. And what Jesus is telling us is don't seek the applause of others. To really engage in a frontal attack on the human ego, don't even announce it to yourself. Don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. Make it inconspicuous, even to yourself. Our giving must not be self-conscious. It must not be without any thought of some credit in this life, which will accrue to our account with others. There's nothing which poisons true goodness more than seeking one's own ends in the process. How did Jesus give? Was there any slightest hint of self-serving motive lurking beneath the surface? When you meet the physical or the spiritual needs of the deprived, if some sense of self-satisfaction or smugness begins to envelop you for just how noble you are, listen closely for the blaring of trumpets. Mankind has always been slow to realize that the most fundamental sin of all does not rest on our treatment of others, but on our stubborn refusal to honor God above all else. Fasting, verses 16 through 18. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. In other words, don't make a show of your abstention from food for spiritual reasons. Fasting is the voluntary denial of a normal function for the sake of intense spiritual activity. And it's not prescribed in the New Testament per se. Jesus assumes that his listeners will fast from time to time when you fast, not if you fast. We tend to take these words to an extreme in which we find ourselves never fasting in this well fed, consumeristic society. Just as we should not take Jesus' teachings on parading your prayers to the extreme of never praying in public, never bowing your head in a restaurant, we should not take his teachings about fasting to automatically assume that there's never a time and a place where you would go without. In the Old Testament, you have public and private fasts. The public fast often attended national emergencies. You see in places such as Joel, the idea of calling a fast and pleading with the Lord in the face of a terrible locust plague. It was spontaneous. In the New Testament, you have occasions where people fasted. In Acts 14, verse 23, they appointed for them elders in every church with prayer and fasting, commending them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Jesus himself went 40 days without food as he began his earthly ministry. He knew about fasting. And it might not be a terrible thing if we knew a little bit more about fasting than we normally do. If your focus on things above, the things of God, spiritual things, forces you for a time, a limited time, to go without food, to go without the normal duties of work, to go without recreation, to go without other things of this world that may distract us from undivided focus on the things of God. We'll be okay if we do it for all the right reasons. To focus on the things of God, to give ourselves to prayer, to think about spiritual things, to overcome the evils of this world by a concentration on our fellowship with God. Fasting is not an end of itself, it is something that attends a focus on spiritual things. And when you do it, though, do not put on a show. When fasting does occur, it's an act of consecration at the outset of a major undertaking. Jesus fasted when he started his ministry. Barnabas and Saul of Tarsus, fasted before they go on their first missionary journey. Acts 13. The elders of Acts 14:23 fasted as they began their ministry as shepherds. But Jesus is not prescribing fasting per se. In the class this morning, we looked at Matthew chapter 9, verse 14, beginning, when the disciples of John came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." Fasting should be appropriate for the circumstances or the occasion, not simply because, as the Pharisee says in Luke 18:12, I fast twice in the week. Good Pharisees would fast every Monday and Thursday. There's a document from the early church, probably the 2nd century, the Didache, which speaks of, okay, the Jews do it on Monday and Thursday, but we do it on Tuesday and Friday. They missed the whole point. If you're going to fast, when you fast, do it with purpose in mind, not simply because a certain day of the week rolls around. The only prescribed fast per se on a regular routine basis in the Old Testament was the Day of Atonement. It will be a Sabbath of solemn rest for you that you may humble your souls. Luke 16:31 and Acts 27 verse 9 speaks of that as the fast. But there was other fasting that would occasionally go on. But Jesus says, when you do it, do not put on a show. Do not do it to be seen by men. Do it for God, not for public display of piety. The lesson here is not so much on fasting as it is on religious showmanship. Again, Jesus is taking a practice familiar to his original audience as a case in point to denounce all religious hypocrisy. It's interesting to note that fasting comes after a model prayer in the middle of this section in which Jesus prays for our daily bread. And before a discussion at the end of chapter 6 of worry about what we shall eat. It's interesting. But if you're going to fast and when you fast, do not disfigure your face. The relevant word there in Greek means to disappear, to render invisible or unrecognizable, to disfigure, perhaps through neglect of personal hygiene, perhaps through hiding themselves with extra large sackcloth with some ashes thrown in, perhaps through smearing their faces to look more pale than they naturally were, as if to draw attention to themselves and the terrible plight they were in because they were so religious. Jesus says they have their reward already. Western culture has taught us to be busy and create our own opportunities, not to be prayerful and let God provide for them. And I'll just say this as kind of a prelude to next Sunday's sermon. Our labors would likely be more fruitful if we spent more time in prayer and perhaps a little time in fasting because we're praying so much before taking up our work. If the critical nature of our petitions should cause us to miss a meal, nothing earth-shattering will have happened. And we will be focused on what's truly important. Andrew Murray says, prayer is one hand with which we grasp the invisible. Fasting, the other hand, with which we let loose and cast away the visible. We cast away the visible while we grasp the invisible. Practical applications. Almsgiving, prayer, fasting. Don't miss the main point back in verse 1. The main point is beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. I do not believe, again, Jesus is saying to privatize your faith. Your faith ought to be a public commodity. But there are always going to be certain aspects of your faith that are between you and God and not for public inspection, if you will, particularly if the motivation is self deification, self glorification? Are we more concerned with externals than internals? That's a valid question here. Are we more concerned with optics than we are with reality? You know, James brings out a great lesson in James chapter 2. And I believe that in trying to do the Lord's work, sometimes we want to put the best face forward. But he says in James chapter 2 that if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes into your assembly, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing, and you say, you sit here in a good place, while you tell the poor man, you stand over there or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are not they the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you are called? Uh-oh. James kind of blew the lid off the cover. And he's exposing sin in the assembly, in first century churches. We can't do that. We need to present only our good side to the world. You know, it's more important to be transparent and just honest than to present only your good side. Because we are poor in spirit, we mourn for our sins, we are meek, we hunger and thirst for righteousness, we are merciful because we need mercy. And so are we more concerned with the externals than the internals? Secondly, um, are we more concerned with what people think of us than what God knows about us? In some ways, Matthew 6 picks up where Matthew 5 leaves off. The Pharisees were preoccupied with external niceties, but the inside was rotten. And God is mostly concerned about what goes on the inside. Samuel says in the selection process of King David in 1 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 7, man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. And finally, mankind has always been slow to realize that the most fundamental sin of all does not rest on our treatment of others, but on our stubborn refusal to honor God above all else. We get preoccupied with what other people can see, but God is the one to whom we owe life, breath, and all things. Colossians 3:13 tells us Christ is everything. Sinful man responds, the self is everything. Whom do you choose? Make your choice. Jesus is not giving you any wiggle room to do anything else. So make your choice. Don't practice your righteousness just to be seen by others. Come clean before God with your sin, just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me. Let's stand and sing a song of invitation.